Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's call. I'm going to give it about one more minute to allow others to get on the line before we go into our agenda. So thanks for your patience. We'll get started in just a minute. Hi, everybody. This is Diane Yantel from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining today's call on coronavirus, disasters, housing, and homelessness. And you'll notice from the agenda that we sent out and the registration link for the call that we have added disasters back into the title of this call, which kind of brings us back full circle to the work of the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. So from the beginning of this pandemic of COVID-19, we talked about how our work at the National Low Income Housing Coalition has for many years focused on equitable recovery, equitable and just and complete recovery after disaster. And we've done that work since all the way back after Hurricane Katrina, and more recently after Hurricane Harvey and Irma and Michael and Maria and others in the California wildfires. So when COVID-19 came to our country, we saw it as the latest disaster to hit our country, although certainly unprecedented in scale and scope and many of its impacts. So now that natural disasters have been hitting again very severely throughout our country, we are looping back in the disaster part of the work, and we will be talking as we move forward with these calls on all disasters, whether it's COVID-19 and its impact on evictions and housing and homelessness, or whether it's natural disasters like Hurricane Laura, the most recent California wildfire, and the derecho in Iowa. And in all cases, we'll be looking at the impacts of these disasters on the lowest income and most marginalized people who are most harmed by disasters. And we'll be working together as the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition towards an equitable and complete recovery for the lowest income people. So thanks again very much for joining. I want to give special thanks to all of our partners from the Gulf Coast and from California and Iowa who were able to join today, despite the recent severe disasters in their communities, in order to share with us what's happening so that we can work together towards an equitable recovery. I also just want to quickly note that next week's national call falls on Labor Day, so we are moving it to Tuesday, September 8th, and we'll have Matthew Desmond and some of his colleagues on from Eviction Lab and other speakers on that call, and we'll send out materials, of course, in advance of that call. So now we have a very full agenda, and I want to jump right in to talk first about some updates on disasters, housing, and homelessness, and to start with our most recent disaster, Hurricane Laura. So we're very fortunate to have a number of partners from Texas and Louisiana on the line today. And we'll start first with our state partner, Texas Housers. And we have Julia Orduña on the call today to share with us some updates from Texas. So Julia, please go ahead.
Hi, Diane. Thank you so much. My name is Julia Orduña, and I am a community navigator with Texas Housers based in Houston, Texas. Pertaining to Hurricane Laura, I've been working with a group of homeowners for the last year that continue to trudge through the bureaucracy of the recovery system after their homes were destroyed by Hurricane Harvey 3 years ago. And the stress level in Houston was very high as people were told of the possibility of these two storms coming our way. Many residents that we work with are elderly or disabled, so the thought of evacuating to a hotel or to a shelter to risk their lives was far worse than risking their lives at their home with possible flooding. And as the storms continue to develop, we began to understand that the preparations for a windstorm were very different from those of a flooding event. The residents began worrying about their medicine or their medical devices that they needed in case of a power outage. As we've learned with COVID, each type of disaster has its specific preparation measures, and we're now taking the time to really talk through those measures with our residents so everyone's well informed and prepared for anything that's to come. My colleague Erica, who works with public housing authorities in Galveston, reported that there was little to no support from their management in informing, directing, or assisting residents with evacuation. The process was frustrating and overwhelming. People with bedridden relatives called hospitals and received no information about evacuation. Residents were told to get on charter buses, but were not informed where they were going or when they were to arrive. We heard accounts from people being left on buses for hours in the middle of the night without any food or water. These buses ultimately arrived in Austin around 3 o'clock in the morning. The next day, there was no recovery staff to inform people of next steps, and we've been told that the hotel staff was very rude and unwelcoming to all these refugees. Houston and Galveston got lucky this time, but we're looking at this as a fire drill, and there's still so much more to do. And just as a quick note on COVID-19 in Texas, evictions continue to happen at different rates throughout the state. In some cities, there have been protections, like in Austin, whose moratorium is in effect until September 30th. However, Mayor Turner in the city of Houston continues to deny a grace period, and the justice of the peace are administering their dockets as they see fit, some not hearing cases and others hearing over 100 eviction cases per week. Our staff is collecting data on eviction and rental assistance program throughout the states to analyze and score jurisdictions based on their renter protections and equitable use of funds. Our website is still under construction, but feel free to check back on our progress, and the website is keeptexanshoused.org. I will drop it in the chat if anyone would like. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. I appreciate that. And I wanted to ask you about the public housing residents in Galveston. One, to know whether they are back in their homes now and how that went. And also whether, I know that maybe you could share a little bit about some of the ongoing challenges for years that are related to the residents in this particular public housing development in Galveston.
Sure. So we did hear that some people were returning already. Some of them were being harassed and being treated badly by the hotel staff, so they were asking to leave, and they were given $50 gas vouchers to be able to return. And those that hadn't returned were returning yesterday. So we are seeing them come back little by little to come back to Galveston, and we have heard that people are returning. As far as just everything in general that has been going on with disaster recovery in Houston, it's been a big issue between the state and the city, because the city of Houston and Harris County were subrecipients of HUD funds from the General Land Office, the GLO, which is administering the state funds. And there have been constant back and forths between these two entities on how the progress or how the program should be administered and what they need. There have been finger pointing and blaming, and things aren't getting done. Right now, there's a lawsuit between the city of Houston and the GLO about these funds. The GLO is trying to strip the city of all of their recovery funds, including their multifamily funding. And they're saying they're trying to work with them, but the residents are the ones really stuck in the middle, and no one's really getting help. We're very confused as to, do we go with the GLO? Do we stay with the city? And that's really, really affecting the stress level and how people are trying to see this recovery apparatus as even being useful. It's been 3 years, and one of my residents actually barely got a scope walk today. This is the first day that someone's come to actually look at and evaluate how much damage has been done in her home 3 years after the storm. And of course, things are getting worse as time keeps passing, mold keeps happening, houses keep shifting in their foundation. So the work that is needed to be done and the cost of these houses getting fixed continues to grow as time progresses. So that's kind of where we're sitting, and we're just hoping that something really happens and maybe the GLO and the city can come to some agreement and really focus on the people, which are the ones that need the money and need the help the most.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Julia, for that. Thanks for all of the work that Texas Housers does, and continue to keep us posted, please. Of course, we're really interested in the tracking that you're doing on evictions throughout the state. So if you could share updates on that, that'll be much appreciated as well. Thanks very much. So I'm going to turn now to our next speaker, who is Denise Galatoff from Southern Mutual Help Association. Denise, please go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about Hurricane Laura and Louisiana. As you can imagine, we are still in early days and still trying to get a handle on everything. So my presentation is going to be a little bit more general in nature. But first, I'll start with just telling you a little bit about Southern Mutual Help Association. We are a 50-year-old not-for-profit. Our work has included everything from affordable housing development, homeownership promotion, policy advocacy, work with fishers and farmers and other families that make their living from Louisiana's lands and waters. And unfortunately, we have developed quite a skill set in hurricane recovery. We've been working on hurricane recovery since Hurricane Andrew in 1992, very, very heavily after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005, where we recovered over 1,000 small businesses and homes in about 120 rural communities across coastal Louisiana. Our emphasis is 100% on rural. And Hurricane Laura had a devastating impact on rural Louisiana. She did come ashore in Cameron, which is a predominantly rural parish. And a lot of the news coverage that we're seeing is in Lake Charles, which is a more urban area. But this storm is like nothing I've seen in my almost 60 years. Hurricane force winds were brought as far over 100 miles inland up along the Texas and Louisiana border. And so of the 23 parishes or counties that were included in the governor's request for disaster declaration, about 18 of those parishes are predominantly rural. Of the 300,000 people without power as of this morning, about half of those are in remote areas, and the same thing with the 150,000 people who did not have access to running water at this time are in rural areas. Our field team is out in vans today and tomorrow, and they're starting along the coast. They're going to start in Cameron Parish, which is where Hurricane Laura came ashore, and they're going from town to town along coastal Louisiana, which is closer to our home base in New Iberia. But we still have to do an on-the-ground assessment, both with our own staff as well as with our partners throughout the state, to try to get an assessment of where our recovery work is most needed up along the Texas border, which is a little bit farther for us geographically. We don't have good numbers on structural damage yet. We don't have good numbers on displacement yet, but we have heard anecdotally that hotels and even Airbnbs are completely full in unimpacted areas of the state. Our emphasis is on rural, and it's also on the recovery and rebuilding phase. We don't do relief, so we're not out there handing out water, but we are trying to make connections with those relief groups on the ground so that we are ready to employ our strategy. Our model is a little bit different. We don't do traditional intake with a lot of paper, but we go into communities based on community intelligence, power of the story, and we do require that participants fit our model, which is built around self-help, a spirit of generosity, and a culture of appreciation. So we are in early days. I'll be happy to update you as we continue to gather data. But yes, Hurricane Laura is going to be dominating our attention for some time to come.
Thank you, Denise. I really appreciate you sharing that and getting on, and absolutely do keep us updated. We'll have you and other partners on these calls moving forward to share with us as you get a clearer picture of what the damage is and what kind of resources are needed from Congress in order to recover. So thank you so much for joining, Denise, and thanks for your really good important work. Also, just before I introduce our next speaker, a reminder to everybody that we send out, at this point, I believe they're 3 times a week, we send email updates to everybody who has asked for them related to disasters, including COVID-19 and others. And in those updates, we'll now also be sharing updates related to Hurricane Laura, both information from the field as damage assessments start to become clear, but also on federal actions in terms of emergency declarations, administrative actions, and overtime actions by Congress. So if you haven't signed up for those email lists and you'd like to be receiving that information, please do. And maybe somebody from the NLIHC team can put in the chat box the link to sign up for those emails. So our next speaker is Renard Thomas from the Reentry Alliance of Louisiana. Renard, please go ahead. Renard, you may be on mute, so you might need to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can, thank you.
Okay. My name is Reentry Thomas, and my role is a lot different. And I wear 2 hats, one with Reentry Alliance and one with logistics. And the night of the storm, I had boots on the ground in Cameron Parish trying to get to safe haven. The next morning, I brought a group of guys in to do assessments and some recovery. And when they got to do recovery, I got to see aerial photos, and we done drone pictures of 80% of the buildings in Cameron couldn't get into Lake Charles because of the chemicals. We got into a bunch of the parishes, and everything that was 2 and 3 stories, not there no more. The roofs inside the buildings, not there. The brick jail, where the sheriff stayed and hunkered down, it's not there no more. He was okay. The inmates that was with him was okay. His staff was okay, but the building is totally gone. They asked us to go find a blind guy, and he was at a home by himself in a 2-story home. The roof was gone and the back of the house was gone, and he was on the 1st floor under the dining room table. He said he had been there for a couple of hours. But when I say not there no more, it looked like a wide open metal. It don't look, you could tell they had homes and buildings there. They're not there no more. I couldn't tell you who used to live in those homes. I could tell you everybody we found, we got out of there. And I could tell you we recovered 3 deceased people. And we got in before the state DMARC team got in. How? I have no clue. The Cajun Navy was on our heels coming in right behind us, and they got in. The Power and Light Company, they got in, and they cleared the wires for us to get in some of the communities we was trying to get into. Because we had other organizations that we work with year-round that does reentry work that we was trying to get to and make sure they was okay. We was also trying to check on the institutions and the jails and make sure those men and women was okay. And then they had just released about 20 people from prison that was like I don't know where to go. I don't know where I am because they're not from that area. So that's why we was there. And since then, on Saturday, we bought portable AC units up and 6 generators. We bought 22 tents up and 140 tarps. And I haven't been back up there since then, since Saturday. And if we thought Katrina was a nightmare, Katrina devastation left a lot of water. This storm left no water, but it tore up everything you can imagine.
Mm.
Man, that's all I could tell you unless you ask some direct questions.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you. I appreciate you sharing that. We've had a few people asking if you can share, if you have any photos, and also asking for us to share your contact information. So with your permission, we'll do that in the follow-up email to participants. And if you have any photos that you can share, that would be helpful.
I do. I'm driving right now, so I can't share them. So
No,
I
of
will
course
get
not now. Later when you're someplace safe and you can. There's also a question about the chemical plant that leaked
Yes.
and is leaking. Can you share more about what's happening and what it means?
The Lake Charles is downwind from the chemical plant. So even though it was leaking, the wind was also blowing the chemicals into Lake Charles. So it wasn't safe for first responders to go in there. And the mask that they gave me had respirators on each side of it. And those respirators, those filters were sealed. And they wouldn't allow us to stay in there with the fire department, but for 4 hours. After 4 hours, you had to come out and get a new respirator because those filters wasn't no good no more. They wasn't safe. So that was a very dangerous situation. And that was on the 2 days after the storm.
Absolutely. Terrible. Do you know how many residents have access to respirators and how many are needed?
None. Nobody had access because the state police could not get in because they showed up with the wrong respirators. The fire department had the right respirators. Cajun Navy couldn't get in. The electrical recovery team could not get in. Integer could not get in. So these respirators they're some special respirators. So for a resident to have access to it, not happening, didn't happen.
Right.
Now today, I don't know what's the situation, but we're gonna survey Wednesday because we're gonna try and go back up in there this weekend. And we have 2 truckloads of supplies, but I just got a call for bananas and Pedialyte. And I couldn't figure out why, and then somebody explained to me they're trying to get those electric lights back in their system. The water don't have it. And the first responders who doing search and rescue, the electric guys who's up there in those trucks, it's hot. And they don't have nothing but water, and water is not gonna give them what they need, so they'll be dehydrated.
Well, tremendous challenges, and we appreciate you so much for doing what you're doing and for sharing it on this call. We have about 500 people on the call now, and we have a much broader list that we send out emails to. This coalition is about 850 organizations around the country, and we're all behind you and want to assist in whatever ways we can. So when you are in a safe place where you can, if you could send us some of those pictures, and if you could send us the information about the donations that are being requested, bananas and the Pedialyte and whatever else is needed, and we can send that out to our listserv and see, who's able to help get some of these immediate needs met. And then we'll hope to continue talking with you and working with you on the longer term needs as well.
No problem.
Great. Thank you so much, Reynard. Take care.
Bye-bye.
So I'll turn now to our state partner from Louisiana, Andreanica Morris from Housing Louisiana, for another report from Louisiana. Andreanica, thanks so much for joining. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for having us. And we're all very sorry to once again be featured in one of these calls. You heard from Renard and Denise, our partners on the ground, about what's going on and what they're dealing with. Here in New Orleans, one of the things that has been an alignment of existing resources is because of the vacancies, because of COVID-19 in our tourism industry, a number of evacuees have taken shelter in New Orleans here. And that's along the way to New Orleans, in between Lake Charles, which is it's one of the most western parts of the state. And it's almost directly opposite of New Orleans in the state. In Baton Rouge and along the way, other places people have taken shelter and been able to take advantage of the vacant hotel rooms. But there are about 5,000 residents from Lake Charles here in New Orleans, and we expect there to be more, A, because we do have the room, and B, because they do need to get away from the conditions that Renard and Denise have described. Unfortunately, we've had some challenges along the way. The mayor of Lafayette has expressed some concerns about taking in evacuees because, and I wish I was exaggerating, worried about outside agitators coming into their community. As a result of the environmental issues in Lake Charles, the fact that they did have some debate around a Confederate statue. And so the worry is that those folks might relocate and infiltrate. So unfortunately, some of this is politics as usual, the same kind of nonsense that we've been dealing with. And this brings into very sharp relief the need for a put housing first strategy, the need for our elected officials locally and statewide to prioritize housing. We once again reaffirm, Denise has been working with us for a number of years now, we need an emergency housing trust fund. That is clear now more than ever. We can't keep doing this. People need to know where to go. And we have been hearing from our partners at the state. They are worried about relocating folks. And again, we need to be doing the resource matching that we have the opportunity to do because of COVID. Things are closed, tourists are not traveling, so we have short-term rentals, vacant hotels. They need to be put into use, not just for the people fleeing the devastation of Laura, but for the people of Baton Rouge, the people of Gonzales and River parishes, and the people of New Orleans who are suffering pre-COVID. We still haven't quite gotten there. And we do need to get there sooner rather than later. Here on the ground, because of Marco and because of Laura, the eviction courts in New Orleans were basically closed last week. And because of the rescheduling, we expect to see the first of the big wave of evictions as a result of the CARES Act expiring. We expect those folks to be in court on Wednesday because Marco, if you guys might remember, because Marco sheared off and it didn't hold together really well. But we thought we were going to get hit on Sunday, and then Lake Charles, Southwest Louisiana was going to get hit on Wednesday night, Thursday. So things closed here in New Orleans for the first 4 days of the week in preparation for all of this, and that included our eviction court. So we are back at that again, and so we expect to see those evictions starting to come home to roost later this week. We still have not seen, because of what's happening, the federal standstill, the Senate Republicans holding bills like the HEROES Act hostage. We have seen no federal relief that will address this. And unfortunately, The coronavirus relief funds that we have had allocated to us were not used for housing. The state has taken the paltry $24 million that it's gotten in CARES Act, CDBG funds, and ESG funds and put that into a woefully underfunded rental assistance program that was exhausted in less than 72 hours. So we are, the communities are dealing with Laura. And one other thing that Bernard did mention is Lake Charles is going to be uninhabitable for quite some time. They are without water totally. So beyond the chemical issues, people can't stay in the city of Lake Charles because they don't have water. We learned about this morning as we were speaking to state partners who are looking for places to relocate folks who, developmentally disabled folks and folks who had housing assistance and other programs. They're looking for some short-term rental housing, 3 to 6 months in New Orleans in the metro area.
Tremendous challenges, Andrea. Thank you so much for sharing them all and for all the work that you're doing. You raised so many important issues about how the confluence of all of this, the natural disasters with COVID-19, with the pending disasters of evictions, and the lack of congressional action. And we are determined to work on all of those together as the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition and through your leadership in Louisiana. So Andrea, thank you again. Definitely
thank you for y'all's support as always.
Yeah, thank you. And before we turn to the California wildfires, I just want to also mention that, Congress is still out on recess, incredibly. They will be back next week on September 8th. And at that point, there's going to be a mad dash to the end of September when they need to pass some sort of bill to keep the federal government running. And it will likely be a continuing resolution. And anything that can get sort of tacked on to that continuing resolution will be the only things really that have a chance of getting enacted this year. And so we will of course be focusing again on the essential need for Congress to implement rent relief now and stop evictions and funding for homeless shelter and service providers. There will also very likely at that point be discussion about a relief bill for communities impacted by the natural disasters. And so we'll need to gear up and get ready to be pushing hard for Congress to provide the kind of resources like Andrea just mentioned, this need for short-term housing assistance in New Orleans. We will need disaster housing assistance, vouchers. We will need a lot of additional funding for rebuilding in Lake Charles and beyond. So we'll be doing that work in between these weekly national calls. We have a number of working group calls that will also be expanded to talk about the natural disasters and the work around that. So our legislative working groups on Tuesdays and our now again weekly working with FEMA working groups and our state and local implementation working groups. They meet weekly in between these national calls. So if you'd like to join any of those weekly calls, let us know. I'll ask somebody from the NLIHC team to put links for those weekly calls in the chat box so you can sign up for those too. So let's turn to our another set of tremendous challenges and natural disasters in California and the wildfires there. And we'll turn to our long-term partners from the California Rural Legal Assistance, Eileen Jacobs and Jeffrey Hoffman, to give a report. So Eileen, do you want to start off?
Yes, thank you, Diane, and thank you for all the work that you're doing, as always, related to these disasters. I will try to be brief and leave most of the time for Jeff to talk about what is happening on the ground, because he is in the county where the most recent wildfire is located. But I will say just generally that we continue to face many of the same issues that we have faced in all of these disasters around the country, where we have mobile home parks with very few resources to recover from disasters, whether we're talking about wildfires in this case, or flooding, or other disasters that they have faced. They have title and registration issues that prevent them from easy access to FEMA assistance and other disaster assistance, and long-term as well as short-term, we're going to have to address some of those issues. We have farm workers who, of course, have very dramatic and special effects from the wildfires, because they are out not only living near the wildfires, as are many others, but they are working in the fields, sometimes without any protection at all. And there's very little protection from the wildfires available for people who are forced to work outdoors. Similar issues as we've had in the past include language access for disaster assistance, and ensuring that people who have limited English ability are able to gain access to the resources that are available. As you know, and you've said, all of these issues are compounded by the pandemic. We have people who are in shelters or need to be in shelters, who are in encampments, some very directly affected by the wildfires, but there is very little to assist them with the distancing that's needed because of the pandemic, at the same time that we're trying to make sure that they're out of harm's way and in some kind of shelter with some resources as a result of the fires. The smoke is ever present, as you can tell from my voice. We continue to be covered in smoke, although it is not as bad as it was in the first several days. But there will be not only the immediate effects of being covered in smoke, but long-term effects for many people, especially vulnerable populations that do not have access to the kinds of respirators, masks that they need to actually help with the smoke. Most of the masks that we're all wearing are not very good at filtering out the particulate matter that's in the air. I think I'll stop there, other than saying that again, that the special problems faced by homeless people who are in encampments to begin with have not begun to be resolved. So those are not only the immediate, but I think the long-term disaster assistance issues that we will have to continue to pay attention to. And with that, let me turn it over to Jeff, because he is in Sonoma County, where the wildfires continue to burn.
Okay, well, thanks, Eileen. I will say at the outset, it's still a little unclear how this is all turning out in terms of who is actually being affected. We're starting to get calls and see the effects, but we may need a bit more time for that. I am concerned when I look at the maps in terms of some of the fires, you know, the areas that are being affected. There's pockets of, even though they are remote areas, there's areas where there's lots of low-income folks that are being affected. And this is just adding on to the issues and strains that people are experiencing due to COVID, you know, not being able to pay rent, and then the eviction cavalcade that's looming. Let me just give a little background real quick. These fires started August 17th. There was a Pacific storm, the remnants of which went north and caused an unusual weather pattern that consisted of thunderstorms and what the Department of Forestry called a lightning siege. And I guess since that date, there's been about 14,000 lightning strikes on the ground, and that's what triggered a lot the fires. During this time, there were about 840 new wildfires 1.42 million acres burned, according to CAL FIRE. The main sort of destructive fires have been affecting the San Francisco Bay Area, which most of the Bay Area counties have been affected by the fires. The fire up near us in Sonoma and Napa and Lake counties, the LNU Lightning Complex fire, is now, I think, the third largest fire in area in California history. It's about 60% contained. 5 of the 7 fatalities from these fires have come from this area. The majority of the fire is burning in the Napa County area, and there was also another area in Sonoma County. It's about 60% contained. I'm concerned about the Napa County area, as again, there's some low-income communities that I see are affected, but I don't have details on that right now. I'm estimating there were maybe up to 322 units or farm workers that probably were evacuated. We saw a group of 50 farm workers who were evacuated, but it seemed to have worked out okay, other than there might be some COVID-related issues that we came upon when we started talking to them. So that might end up being the major issue there. Yeah, the other fire that I'm concerned about is in the Monterey Bay area, which is in Santa Cruz County. I guess there were 77,000 folks evacuated there. And again, there's a lot of areas where there's pockets of low-income folks, even though again, it's remote areas. There's some communities where I know there are low-income folks that were being affected. Again, I don't have details, but I do have concerns about that. President Trump declared a major disaster, disaster number 4588 on August 22nd, which includes provision for individual assistance. So FEMA is now here on the ground. Local assistance centers have been opened in Santa Cruz, Monterey, Napa, Sonoma, and Solano counties. We've been out to the local assistance centers. There's 2 of them in Sonoma County. And we're starting, I mean, I'm not saying there were huge numbers, but what we're seeing are people who were evacuated without food, people with structures who were destroyed that need assistance. Again, though, it's hard to get a sense in the long run of who or how people are going to be affected, but we're going to be monitoring and following up. The assistance centers will be open for the next at least another week and maybe longer, and then we'll get maybe a better sense. The issues, again, we're seeing are related mostly to evacuations. Again, folks without food or having trouble, navigating being evacuated. And as Eileen said, the air quality issues were really bad, but are starting to get better. The Cal OSHA last year came out with air quality standards for those working outside and procedures, but they really don't go far enough. So there's been pushes to raise the standards that will trigger, actually lower the thresholds that will trigger when protective equipment will be required. So we've been monitoring that. We haven't seen anything real major or of concern yet, but I am concerned that there were a lot of farm workers, working in areas that were near the fire and were evacuated. So we're going to continue to investigate and follow up on that. So I guess that's really all I have, unless there's any questions. Thanks for having us on.
Well, thanks for being on, and thanks as always for your really good and important work. There's one question, Eileen, you mentioned the issue with mobile home title issues. Of course, that's something that we've all been working on and focused on for a long time in California and in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, and all the way back to Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina. But can you just really briefly share, for those who might not know, what those issues are?
Yes, there are many mobile home owners who lack their mobile homes typically are in mobile home parks. This is not individual mobile homes as a general rule on their own sites. But for mobile home owners who have mobile homes in parks, they often do not have proper title, or in a state where separate registration is required, they do not have proper registration for their home, which means that there is a chain of title somewhere and someone else is identified as the owner because the proper documents of title were never recorded and the proper registration and title documents were never submitted to the state, which is where in California you would be submitting records of title and registration with the state, as well as in the county where you're located if you own it. So when title and registration are a problem, and they often are, in particular with low-income people who reside in somewhat substandard mobile home parks, if they need repair, if they need replacement, when they've been damaged, when people have been evacuated, they are unable to demonstrate that they are the recorded title holder, and that then becomes a barrier to their obtaining disaster assistance, either what's available from the state and always in terms of FEMA assistance, because FEMA requires a document showing the proper title in the person's name who's applying for disaster assistance. This has been a persistent problem in all of the disasters, and there needs to be a much simpler and more friendly and more available declaratory alternative so that it is easier for the people who actually do own the mobile homes to just declare under penalty of perjury that they're the owner and be eligible for assistance.
Yeah, thank you for that, Eileen. And this is something, as I said, the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition has been working on for a long time as it relates to California and as it relates to Puerto Rico, and FEMA has been unwilling to make the very necessary and obvious changes to their title documentation requirements, although we have been starting to make some progress with the relevant committees in Congress. And so we'll continue to push on that. And again, we'll talk about that kind of work in our legislative working group calls. But Eileen and Jeffrey, again, thank you so much for all your great work, and thanks for joining today. And I'll turn now to Sarah Buck from the city of Cedar Rapids to talk about what's happening in Iowa after the terrible derecho storms did a tremendous amount of damage in that city. So Sarah, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for having me this afternoon. So I first want to talk a little bit about COVID and some of the issues that we were seeing back in March and beginning in April as COVID started really becoming high levels in our community. We started seeing an increase in homelessness due to families that were doubled up and were asked to leave due to the fear of the spread of COVID. And so we started seeing additional families showing up in our shelter system, and those systems began to become severely impacted because they are also at a reduced level of the number of people that they could assist due to the COVID restrictions for congregate housing. And then the evictions started going through the courts at the end of May. And then after the CARES Act ended, so in July as well. So we started seeing increases there. So our city had to quickly create non-congregate shelters with congregate sheltering options for people that were showing up at congregate shelters with either symptoms or were COVID positive coming out of our hospital systems being sent over by the county. So we had to start putting people up in hotels and figuring all of that out, as well as creating an eviction prevention program to really try to curb a lot of those evictions and try to keep people in housing as much as possible, because we knew that there was another place for them to go. And then the derecho hit on August 10th, which is essentially an inland hurricane. So a lot of the comments that I was hearing about Hurricane Laura really are very, very similar, even though we're in, the center of the U.S., not seeing obviously any water, but just the sheer winds, straight line winds that hit our community. We're the second largest city in Iowa. About 75 square miles of Cedar Rapids, all of it was hit, along with other surrounding communities. And so I think that I've heard some conflicting information, anywhere from 125 to 145 mile per hour winds, which I've been told is like a Category 2 hurricane. Just not something that we've ever experienced in Iowa that I'm aware of in my lifetime. But really, all of the trees in our city are, I would say probably 90% are gone. We've had roofs ripped off. I've seen large steel I-post signs bent to the ground. All of our lighting and on our roadways were all impacted. We end up having DOT come in and help clear roads just because of the sheer amount of debris. No one had any power or internet or cell service for the first 2 days, which severely impacted the way that we were able to respond to the storm. And probably about day 3 is really when we started getting cell service back. There's 240,000 people in the area without power. They've said about 80% of our corn and soybean farms have been impacted and have damage. Just overall, it was very devastating to our community. We had a flood back in 2008, which impacted a certain area in our city, and we were able to kind of secure the area and help the people in that area and move folks out of that impacted area, where this hit our entire city. So finding places to put people became very, very difficult, and hotels that weren't damaged filled up very quickly. Some of the things that we've noticed that, obviously lessons learned as we move forward, and if there's ways to improve in the future, some of our senior facilities, even the HUD funded senior facilities, did not have generators. So we had, 100 seniors that had CPAP machines and dialysis machines that they had no electricity to run. Landlords began issuing 12 to 48 hour notices to vacate to tenants about 2 to 3 days in after the storm, even for properties that were not placarded, which obviously were legal, but many of these folks did not speak English. We have a large refugee immigrant families that are in some of these properties, and were asked to leave so quickly. We had to, on a Saturday evening, go out and help about 200 refugees get resources through the Red Cross and provide hotels and storage facilities and things of that nature in a very quick manner. We're still currently working on our short-term housing options, because what we're seeing is, as insurance agents get out and do assessments of properties and wanting to get in and start doing those repairs, the actual work of doing the repairs makes the unit, even though it may not be 100% uninhabitable, may be difficult for somebody to live there. So we're just trying to figure out, where do we place people for 8 days or maybe 2 weeks or up to 3 months while these apartment complexes make their repairs. That's really been the challenge, because all of our hotels are full of people that have damage to their properties where they're not able to live at home right now, or an insurance company's putting people up in a hotel room. So besides the overall just impact to the shelters, still working on that kind of short-term housing options so that we can hopefully get things fixed. But finding a contractor right now, I'm sure, as you all know, is very difficult when, this amount of damage has been done in an area. So that's really our struggle right now. And I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has.
Sarah, thank you so much. It's just unbelievable, the size of that storm in Iowa and the degree of damage that it did. So thank you for sharing that. Did you say before the derecho, you were talking about the COVID-19 impacts on evictions, and you were talking about non-congregate shelters being created. Did you say at least some of those are in response to evictions from COVID-19, that people are showing up at homeless shelters after having been evicted?
Yeah, that's correct. So we saw an increase prior to when the eviction ban moratorium was still in place. We did have some landlords that were still threatening evictions. So people would just pack up and leave, fearful that they were going to be evicted. So we were seeing that, as well as kind of our doubled up population. So families that may have no place to go, that were staying with a friend or another family member, that were then asked to leave due to COVID, just because of exposure, not wanting additional people in their household because of exposure. But then, yeah, we were seeing folks that were actually evicted. Those evictions started at the end of May, that some of those properties that weren't covered by the CARES Act.
Just terrible. Well, thank you for sharing this, and thank you for all of your good work and for the updates. We'd love to stay in touch on continuing needs, and certainly to work with you to get Congress to provide the resources you'll need to rebuild and get people housed quickly.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so we're going to turn now to talk more and more directly about coronavirus, housing, and homelessness. And so for this section, I'm actually going to turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Stadian, to facilitate the remainder of the call. So Sarah, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks, Diane. Appreciate that. Our first speaker, touching on COVID response and the impact on low-income people and renters, people experiencing homelessness. First, we'll turn it over to Sam Batko, who is a senior research associate with the Urban Institute. Urban has put together a really great mapping and prioritization tool that I think is going to be really helpful to communities as they're deciding how and where to put their emergency rental assistance funds. So I'll turn it over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Sarah. So I was asked to, as Sarah mentioned, present on this new tool that the Urban Institute came up with. And just by way of background, I know there's hundreds of people on the call and not everybody might be familiar with who we are, but the Urban Institute is a nonprofit research organization based in Washington, D.C., and our mission is really to improve the lives of people in their communities. And so I work in our Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center, and specifically my area of expertise is on homelessness. And I worked with a team of people at Urban to build this tool, and that the expertise of that team spanned homelessness, evictions, rental assistance programs more generally, as well as included our data science team and our data visualization team. So this was really a big team effort, and I want to give my colleagues a lot of credit for all of the work that went into it. Next slide. And so this tool was created as part of a partnership that Urban is a part of, the Framework for an Equitable COVID-19 Homelessness Response. This partnership is with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, as well as a number of other national partners, including the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, the National Alliance on Homelessness, and the National Health Care for the Homeless Council. It was funded by the Melville Charitable Trust, Funders for Housing and Opportunity, as well as the MacArthur Foundation. Next slide. The purpose of the tool. So the goal for this tool is that it would help local decision makers, so people who are the head of their housing and community development agency or the head of their housing authority, or even just community-based organizations that may have rental assistance resources, or if there is a local government that had been doing money, like raising money or using their own local or state funds to administer rental assistance. It was to help these decision makers who are in charge charge of deciding where to spend rental assistance dollars and who to spend them on, and guide them in a way that contributes to minimizing evictions and homelessness in a way that also promotes racial equity. And so the way that the tool works is it identifies priority neighborhoods using a variety of characteristics. So economic and demographic indicators from prior to COVID-19, as well as job loss during COVID-19, and it creates a score for each census tract in a county. In fact, it creates a score for each census tract within the country, and then ranks those scores within each state so that you can find out where each census tract falls in the percentile for the state. And so next slide. This is a snapshot of the tool, and I realize that if you're on a small screen, it might be kind of small, but this is Franklin County, it's Columbus, Ohio, and you can see how it displays here. Each census tract is a color based on where in the percentile in the state of Ohio the census tract falls. The index itself is the primary driver of what color the census tract is, and is also the top and most important number that's presented here. But the index is built on 3 sub-indices, and so there's a housing instability risk sub-index, a COVID-19 impact sub-index, and an equity sub-index. And you can see the information for each of those sub-indices as well. So while you get an overall 95th percentile, for example, of this census tract in the Emergency Rental Assistance Priority Index, you can also see that it falls in the 96th percentile for the housing instability sub-index, the 89th for the COVID-19 sub-index, and the 89th for the equity sub-index. The individual indicators that build each of those sub-indices are listed here as well. And we'll just go to the next slide since I talk a little bit about that there. You can learn more about those individual indicators on the Urban website for the tool, as well as in the technical appendix. And each of those indicators were chosen because there's an empirical link between them and homelessness and eviction. And then also we included factors that could be contributing to a household's vulnerability during this period of COVID-19. And so that includes the disproportionate impacts disproportionate health and economic impacts that are being distributed to people of color by COVID-19, as well as job loss and health insurance coverage. Not all of the indicators and not all of the indices are weighted equally. And again, you can learn a little bit more about this in the technical appendix and on the tool page itself. Race is weighted as heavily as all of the other indicators within the race sub-index, and the housing instability index is rated as half of the overall index. And you can go to the next slide. And I'll just wrap up by saying that this is the short link that takes you directly to the tool itself, and I can actually put that in the chat too for everybody. And also that this was a very short presentation of the tool, and it's how we built it and how you can use it, but we'll be giving a longer presentation on the tool during the state and local implementation call that NLIC holds. That's next Wednesday. I believe it's next Wednesday, September 9th.
Thank you so much, Sam. I think this is an incredibly useful tool because it allows advocates and state and local government officials in real time to be making choices about how they allocate funds. Are you sharing this information, or how are you sharing this information with local government officials, and how can folks on this call help contribute to that?
Sure, absolutely. So the information about this tool went out to every single continuum of care, every single ESG and CDBG grantee, and so all 12,000 of those people combined received a direct email directing them to this tool. So it should have been seen. So if you're an advocate or a community-based organization, you can go and say, you should have received an email about this. You can also reach out directly to me, and I'm happy to provide you with some additional information. And I'm sure my email will get circulated by the NLIHC team following the call. We are also doing a series of webinars with key partners, so the National League of Cities and the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and then there was one other, and I can't remember right now, I'm sorry. And so to do presentations on the promotion of the tool. We actually have heard that a couple of jurisdictions are already planning to use it to administer their CARES Act rental assistance dollars, which is pretty exciting. And, you know, we really are encouraging people to think about this tool as an opportunity to contribute to a community-based process. And so, as I mentioned, we were part of this partnership for a framework for an equitable COVID-19 response. And there's lots of information about how to build that community-based process and what that decision-making process can look like. And this tool can just be a part of that. And so I encourage you to use it if you're involved in any type of community-based process, making decisions about those rent assistance dollars.
That's great. I'm sure many of our partners and those on the call will be using this tool, again, because it provides a really, tangible, concrete feedback about where resources should be allocated. And I see that we've shared the tool in the chat box for people to dig into further. If people have questions, they can reach out to you. And as you mentioned, we'll be discussing this in greater depth on the working group call, the state and local implementation working group call, which is later this week on Wednesday. We do have a couple of questions, if you don't mind. One question is whether or not you've shared it also with the National Council of State Housing Agencies. They are an organization that oversees HFAs who have been operating rental assistance programs in response to COVID.
Yeah, so we have shared it with that group. We've shared it with a number of national groups that sit in what we would consider like the trade organizations for housing agencies, housing finance agencies, PHAs, HCBs, and so our Urban has a stakeholder outreach team that does that sharing for us, and it has been widely shared through those networks.
That's great. That's great. And then other question is just to clarify, which of the state and local implementation working groups will you be speaking on? And I believe you're speaking this Wednesday, September 2nd. Is that right?
No, September 9th.
No, September 9th. Okay, great. So people have a week or so to dig into the tool and come back to you with their questions about how to use it.
Absolutely.
That sounds great. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Sam. Really impressive work here, and we appreciate you putting this together.
Yep, and I look forward to giving a more detailed presentation in a little over a week.
Great, thank you. Next, we're going to talk about other ways to track evictions and displacement. We've invited our friend Noelle Porter from the National Housing Law Project to share with us some of the new tools and information that they've been collecting. Noelle? Are you there, Noelle? You might want to unmute your line.
I did it twice, so that just muted me all over again. Thanks so much, Sarah. I want to share just quickly the context for why I'm presenting some of this data. As I'm sure most of the folks on this call know, the federal evictions moratorium ended on July the 24th. Sarah mentioned in Iowa, their state moratorium ended in May. Obviously, there's never been a moratorium, although some states or localities may cover this, for private renters in any market. And so we've seen this sort of trickle effect of evictions coming through the system, both legally and illegally. And it's really hard to understand where those are happening and how. And so we have been trying to find new ways to kind of identify folks that are coming through the woodwork and entering the legal system, before those courts report that they've had these filings, or before people are able to share that data with groups like the Evictions Lab. And so, we have been gathering some data, and there's a really helpful tool called 211, and we want to help folks just to understand how urgent this crisis is becoming as we reach this intersection of federal moratorium expiring, the state moratoriums expiring. I believe when I last checked, 17 more moratoriums remained in states across the country, and LIHC has been tracking those. You can find them on their site. As the unemployment benefits expire. We've had plenty of data to show us that that unemployment insurance is half the reason folks have been able to keep up with their rent to date. And even the small business loans, which have been keeping folks on their rolls, have been keeping folks employed in these small businesses, all of that has expired, and we expect a real explosion. And I'm sure we've heard this number mentioned many of times. It could be as many as 30 to 40 million evictions. But right now, as we begin the judicial process, it's really hard to understand how and when that's happening. And so I want to tell you all a little bit about 211. I'm sure folks are somewhat familiar or may have heard of it. 211 is a comprehensive source of locally curated social services information. So when you call 211, you receive referrals for housing or utilities assistance, physical and mental health services, assistance finding and obtaining employment, services directly dealing with homelessness. And the 211 network also includes a number of national crisis hotlines. 211 is currently available to almost 95% of the US population. In 2018, there were more than 12.8 million connections made. And translation services in the 211 system are available in up to 180 languages. So it's a really incredible resource. So two things. One, if you are an individual who's seeking services or wants to connect with someone who can help you find the help that you need, you can always call 211 on a range of issues. If you're an organization who has not previously connected with 211 in your area, or an advocate who has not previously connected, you can follow the instructions in this link to make sure that yours is a resource that's included in their guides when these 211 folks get the call. And so 211 has provided a lot of summary data. All of this is publicly available. We want to show the trends that are really important to the work that we're doing, and especially to the advocacy that we're doing, as Sarah's going to speak to in just a moment. That is not the full, there we go. So utilities and rental assistance over the past 5 months have been trending up, either steadily or some in sharp increase. And two of the most important ones we want to point out, this is data from 33 states. There's a link to this report. There's been a major jump in utility needs as disconnection bans begin to expire. And so if your community had a ban on disconnecting your utilities, that may be ending, and you may see a major jump in folks needing assistance for utility payments. And then rental assistance calls have actually been slowly declining since April. Like I said, with all the different assistances and resources available in the intervening months, especially the unemployment insurance, that, you know, we really saw folks kind of at least holding their ground across the country, although we know that's not true for the lowest income folks. And but timed perfectly with the federal, state, and state eviction moratorium expirations, we're now seeing a significant jump in calls for rental assistance. And landlord-tenant issue calls have been increasing steadily throughout. And there's an NHLP report that we did with legal aid attorneys across the country to understand how folks were faring in tenant-landlord relationships, and there is a ton of data available on just how abusive landlords have been in, as I think Sam mentioned before, trying to harass or intimidate folks to ensure that they may self-evict prior to receiving any type of legal notice or legal filing. And so they really work to just kind of intimidate, especially folks who may be undocumented or may have criminal records, and say, I'm coming for you, I'm getting you out of here. And folks may simply kind of flee in the middle of the night to avoid any of those proceedings. So I wanted to just show you a number of a couple of state dashboards that I've selected, but if you click this link when you receive these slides afterward, you'll be able to find data for about 20 states that we have so far. Want to show, this is for, I can't believe these slides are doing this, Washington State. As an example, housing and shelter calls for Washington State are up 21% this August over the same time last year. They received more than 8,000 calls about how to shelter in July. Housing and shelter was clearly the most pressing issue for all callers, representing about more than a quarter of inquiries, and more than a third of those calls were requesting rental insurance. 17% of Washington State residents who called were also requesting information about shelter. So Iowa, I thought was a really interesting case. Obviously, their most pressing need seems to be healthcare, even though it's an expansion state, which really concerns me. But housing and shelter calls are up 73% over this time last year. So if folks want to call Crapo and tell him that this is a huge issue and the banking committee should be heavily engaged in negotiations, no hesitation here. Housing and shelter was the second most pressing issue, about 12% of inquiries, but more than 50% of those folks were requesting rental assistance, and 24% needed information about shelter. And I'm sure some of that increase obviously reflects the derecho information that Sarah was giving us. Also pulled from Kentucky really quickly so that folks can call McConnell and tell him that Congress has to act. Housing and shelter represented 35% of the calls coming in. They're up about 16% over this time last year. And 65% of those folks wanted rental assistance. So we know Congress has to do what Diane mentioned, and Sarah's going to tell us some information about how you could be active in those negotiations. Also, utility-related calls in Kentucky saw a very significant increase. And finally, I've got two more. I pulled from Virginia, same kind of statistics, but housing and shelter calls in Virginia are up 120% over the same time last year. We know that Virginia leads the country in evictions and has since long before the pandemic, with 5 of their cities representing half of the top 10 eviction cities in the country. A lot of folks were calling, about 25% calling about housing and shelter. Almost 55% were requesting rental assistance and 21% seeking information about shelter. And finally, for folks in Maine or folks who want to press our THUD committee chair in the Senate, Susan Collins, about how important this issue up. Housing and shelter calls in Maine are up 72% over August of last year. Housing and shelter only represented about 10.5% of overall inquiries, but of those folks that were calling, 35% need rental assistance and 19% were seeking information about shelter. I can save questions till the end or look through the Q&A, but Diane or Sarah, if you want to ask me something specific before we move on, let me know.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat box and on the Q&A of people who want to have copies of this presentation. We will definitely share it with folks after the call in our Monday disaster update. So look for it in your email tonight. Some folks are wondering, I think one of the best pieces of this information is we hear a lot of skepticism from Republican senators that all of these warnings we have about evictions aren't going to come true, right? They're a little skeptical that that's going to happen. And this is a really critical tool of showing need on the ground before we actually get to a formal eviction or something that we can later point to Republican offices. So I'm wondering, what has been the response when you've shared it with Republican offices? Is that how you're reading it also?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct, Sarah. It's really important to understand that the sharp increases in July across states reflect how dire the need is now becoming with all those intersections we discussed. And so we know for the most part that we're probably seeing a very sharp increase in eviction filings. Unfortunately, no one collects that data and reports it in real time. So like you said, this is the best indicator we have that folks in communities are desperate. And I'm seeing a lot of questions about like how this data can be used, if you can write blog posts with it, if it's public. It is. There's a link within these slides when you receive them, as Sarah mentioned. These are just screenshots of the state dashboards, but you can go into these dashboards and play with the data and understand the data and break out the data. And so you can use this to try to get to your county level, to try to understand what's happening in your community and to be really specific with what you understand. I just wanted to share some highlights.
Great. And so one of the questions is, can you get data on a more local level by county? Is that possible through that dashboard?
It depends. There are two things. One, Some states like California and Florida and New York have multiple 211s in their state. Maine even has 3. And so you often get a little more granular with the data simply by manipulating the dashboard and picking which local 211 you'd like to use. But 211 is very open about this data, and they want to be as forthcoming with the data as possible. And so there's a link on the 211 website, and I think it's 211.org, but you can just Google 211, where you can request data from your local community organization, or you can simply call your local community organization and request the data. And so there are a lot of ways to play with this data, to get involved in this data, or even to access it. And I would encourage you to be proactive on the ground. And again, I'll just underscore, if you are a local organization or advocate that has not been familiar with 211 in the past, or you're not receiving referrals from them, I would really encourage you to get connected and make sure you're a part of their resource list so that they can connect folks to you in the future.
Yeah, this is incredibly helpful. I'm going to ask somebody from the NLHC staff to put in the chat box a link to the tool, because I see so many people who are very eager to get started digging into this. But Noelle, I wanted to thank you for sharing this information with us. It's really helpful.
Sure, and the link to the tool is on the green main title slide for whomever is posting.
Great, thanks, Noelle. Now we're going to shift over how we can use these resources in our advocacy. First, I'll give a really quick update about where things are in Congress. As we know, Congress is still on recess. Diane mentioned that at the top of the call. They are scheduled to come back after Labor Day, and hopefully we'll get started at restarting negotiations over the next COVID relief package. It's looking more and more likely that if Congress is able to pass a relief package, it will be tied to a continuing resolution that's needed to keep the government open when the new fiscal year starts on October 1st. Congress is scheduled to take another recess leading up to the election starting on October 2nd. So that means there's really a very small window of opportunity here. There's just a few weeks for Congress to negotiate a package and vote it through. But there are some positives about linking the two together. The CR is considered must-pass legislation. Otherwise, the federal government would shut down because it doesn't have funds to operate. And so if there is a CR that's moving, it might make it easier to see a COVID relief package get through as well by attaching the two. But it does also raise some risks. If Congress doesn't reach a deal on that CR COVID relief package, it could mean that there's another government shutdown, which we know is very harmful, not only to federal housing programs, but to the people that they serve. There's also a remaining question about how broad a package would be added to the CR. How robust is it going to be? Is it just going to be unemployment insurance and PPP loans for small businesses, or is it going to be broad enough to address all of the needs of low-income people and people experiencing homelessness? For what it's worth, House Democrats are still continuing to push for the COVID relief legislation to be passed separate from the CR. They believe that tying the two together just makes things more complicated and difficult to pass. I worry that combining the two might mean that there's a shift in leverage so that Democrats might be forced to accept a smaller relief package than they would otherwise because they don't want to be blamed for a government shutdown. It's unclear so far what this will look like, but we're paying very close attention to it. What I do know is that there, as Noelle had pointed out, there's growing pressure again for reaching a deal. Small businesses that receive PPP loans have spent most of that money, and there are no new funds for them to apply for. Some states are working to try to get the extra $300 a week in UI benefits as a result of Trump's executive action, but people haven't necessarily received those dollars yet. So only 5 states have actually started to send out the expanded UI benefits. Most people who were in need haven't received any assistance for the last month. Okay, so that means that we're going to start to see more and more people who aren't able to pay their rent, even more than before. At this exact moment, though, that pressure hasn't resulted in any change in negotiations between Pelosi and the White House. This past week, Speaker Pelosi and the White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, spoke for the first time in weeks, and by everyone's account, it seemed to go nowhere. Pelosi said that essentially until Republicans agree on a $2 trillion package, which is the midway point between what Democrats and Republicans have proposed, she doesn't really need to have conversations with Meadows. Meadows said that Democrats are being too difficult and unwilling to compromise. So that might be a little bit of posturing, but I think we'll start to see some of that change in the next week or so. We'll get a better sense of how quickly this is going to move. The other thing I think is important to know that if there is a disaster supplemental to address the needs in Louisiana, Texas, Iowa, and California, that too might be tied to a continuing resolution and a COVID relief package. These are all very big bills. They can be difficult bills for Senate Republicans to vote on. And so there might be an interest from Mitch McConnell to package them all into one bill so that he can minimize the number of harmful votes or difficult votes that his caucus has to take. So I suspect that in a month from now, we'll see all three of those pass, and we'll make sure to keep you guys updated about specific ways that you can advocate. And with that, I'll turn it over to our dear colleague of ours, Joey Lindstrom, who can talk to you about ways that you can get involved.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you everybody for being on this call. One of the best ways to get involved remains unchanged. We really hope that you will reach out to the staff members for your members of Congress in both the House and the Senate, and make sure that they are hearing about the extraordinary needs for $100 billion of emergency rental assistance, a nationwide comprehensive moratorium on evictions, and $11.5 billion in ESG, emergency solutions grants funding. This is all what we know will be necessary to keep people stably and safely in their homes as the pandemic and the recession continue to unfold. Sarah mentioned that Congress is coming back on Tuesday of next week, and this is an excellent time for those of you who have already done meetings or had email exchanges with staffers in your congressional delegation to reach back out to them and remind them that housing needs to be a priority as negotiations move forward. We know that your advocacy makes a difference. So those of you who have not yet reached out to staffers for your members of Congress, please know that there are probably other organizations in your community that might have done so, but adding your voice additionally is extremely important. For those of you who have already been in touch with some advocacy, remember that we need our supporters to be our champions, and we need those who are undecided to come on board. So please think of your advocacy not as a one-time interaction, but as an ongoing conversation. I will remind you that our talking points are available on the website in the COVID-19 Take Action section, as well as in our virtual lobby day resources from July, a bunch of template emails to request a meeting and to maximize a digital or virtual lobby meeting. We also have available any information you might need about the staff people who cover housing in offices on Capitol Hill. So reach out to myself or Brooke or Tori or Kyle on the field team, and we can get you that information very quickly. Finally, our communications team wanted me to highlight some of their excellent work putting together a tweet storm with our friends at Coalition on Human Needs that will take place on Wednesday, September 9th from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock Eastern time, emphasizing the hashtag that Congress needs to hashtag get back to work, specifically on the housing elements of the HEROES Act. There are going to be some sample tweets and messaging that we distribute, and it really focuses on evictions and some of the struggles that households are facing throughout the recession. And please also, if you haven't already done so, take a look at our story sharing, story banking resource. I believe Lisa is posting that into the chat box right now. Please do find, share, and provide stories that puts a human face on the people who are suffering due to Congress's inaction. And share these stories not just with our story banking effort, but make sure that you are not using just data, but also stories in all of your interactions with the media. We know that members of Congress and their staff read local media very regularly, and as many news reports as we can get about the costs of this recession in very real ways to people who are struggling to afford their housing will go a long way to convincing Congress to include housing and our priorities in any final spending package. The link for the story banking form just got posted, and it'll also be included in our Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition update email that will go out in about an hour today. That's my update, Sarah.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank everybody again for joining our call today. It's incredibly helpful to hear from folks on the ground in Louisiana, Texas, Iowa, and California, where I know it's very difficult for you to step away from the important work that you're doing there. So we appreciate that. And thanks to our other speakers too for sharing tools and resources that we can all be using in our advocacy. And with that, I will see you next week. Thank you.